Alex had always believed in forever. At 27, he thought he understood what love meant, what commitment looked like, what marriage could withstand. He'd met David when he was just 18, fresh out of high school and fumbling through his first year of college. David was 3 years older, confident in a way that made Alex feel safe, grounded. They'd been inseparable from that first conversation at a campus coffee shop, talking until the place closed around them. 9 years. That's how long they'd been together before they married 2 years ago. 9 years of shared dreams, inside jokes, late-night conversations about the future they'd build together. David had been Alex's first real love, his anchor through the chaos of early adulthood. They'd weathered Alex's family's initial disapproval, David's struggle to find his career path, financial stress, and the general growing pains that come with building a life with another person. Marcus had been there through it all. David's best friend since childhood, the brother he'd never had. Marcus was the one who'd helped David pick out the engagement ring, who'd stood beside him at their wedding, who'd been the first person David called when he got his dream job. If David was Alex's anchor, Marcus had somehow become their lighthouse, steady, reliable, always there when they needed guidance through rough waters. In the early days of their relationship, Alex had sometimes felt like an outsider to the friendship between David and Marcus. They had shared history stretching back to elementary school, a shorthand communication built over decades. But Marcus had welcomed Alex with open arms, including him in their traditions, making space for him in their dynamic. Over the years, Alex had come to think of Marcus not just as David's best friend, but as his own dear friend too. The changes in David didn't happen overnight. They crept in slowly, like shadows lengthening at dusk. It started innocuously enough, an extra beer with dinner, a glass of wine while watching TV, drinks with colleagues that ran later than usual. Alex noticed, but didn't worry. David had always enjoyed social drinking, and work stress seemed to be mounting with his new position. But gradually, the drinking became less social and more solitary. David would come home with the smell of alcohol already on his breath, would pour himself a drink before even greeting Alex properly. Weekend mornings that used to begin with coffee and lazy conversations now started with David nursing hangovers and irritability. The first fight that really scared Alex happened on a Tuesday night in March. David had been drinking steadily since arriving home from work, growing more agitated as the evening wore on. When Alex suggested they talk about planning a vacation they'd been discussing, David exploded. The words came out slurred but sharp, accusations that Alex was trying to control him, that he couldn't even relax in his own home without being nagged. Alex tried to de-escalate, to speak calmly, but David's anger seemed to feed on itself. When Alex reached out to touch David's arm, trying to physically ground the conversation, David shoved him away with enough force that Alex stumbled backward into the kitchen counter. The shock of it, the physical contact born of anger rather than love, left both of them frozen. David seemed to sober up instantly, horror washing over his face. He apologized profusely, promised it would never happen again, held Alex while they both cried. For weeks afterward, David was extra attentive, bringing home flowers, cooking dinner, being the partner Alex remembered falling in love with. Alex convinced himself it had been an aberration, a one-time loss of control brought on by work stress and too much alcohol. But it wasn't one time. Over the following months, a terrible pattern established itself. David would drink, grow agitated over minor things or nothing at all, and lash out. Sometimes it was just words, cruel observations about Alex's appearance, his job, his family, his worth as a partner. Sometimes it escalated to shoving, grabbing, once a slap that left Alex's cheeks stinging for hours. The next day, David would always be remorseful. He'd apologize with tears in his eyes, promise to do better, suggest they do something special together. These reconciliation periods became their new normal, David making grand gestures to atone for behavior that was becoming increasingly frequent and unpredictable. Alex found himself walking on eggshells, trying to read David's moods, attempting to prevent the explosions by managing his own behavior. He stopped bringing up topics that might agitate David. He started making excuses to friends when bruises were visible. He began to isolate himself, too ashamed to admit what was happening behind their closed doors. The worst part was that sober David was still the man Alex had fallen in love with. During the day, when David was at work, when they were with friends, during the good moments that still existed between them, Alex could glimpse the person he'd married. This David was funny, thoughtful, ambitious. This David would surprise Alex with his favorite takeout, would remember anniversaries, would curl up against him at night and whisper about their shared future. It was this David that kept Alex hoping, kept him believing that if he could just find the right words, the right approach, he could help his husband overcome whatever demon was driving him to drink. Alex researched addiction, attended Al-Anon meetings in secret, tried different ways of broaching the subject of David's drinking. But every attempt was met with denial, anger, or dismissal. Throughout this deteriorating situation, Marcus remained a constant. He'd always been someone Alex could talk to, but as things got worse at home, Marcus became a lifeline. When David would disappear on weekend drinking binges, Marcus would check on Alex. When Alex showed up to group gatherings with unexplained bruises, Marcus was the one who pulled him aside with genuine concern. Marcus had known David longer than anyone, and he could see the changes too. He'd tried talking to his best friend about the drinking, had offered to help him find treatment, had even threatened to cut off their friendship if David didn't get help. But David was as dismissive of Marcus's concerns as he was of Alex's. What Alex didn't expect was how much he began to rely on Marcus's presence. Marcus had always been attractive, tall, with kind eyes and an easy smile, but Alex had never thought of him in any way other than as David's friend. Now, though, Alex found himself looking forward to Marcus's visits, to the way Marcus would really listen when Alex spoke, to the gentle way Marcus would check on him after particularly bad nights. Marcus had his own apartment across town, but he started spending more time at their house. He'd bring dinner when he knew David was likely to come home drunk and belligerent. He'd stay late, helping Alex clean up after David passed out, providing a calm presence in the chaos. Sometimes Alex would wake up to find Marcus had slept on their couch, having stayed to make sure everything was okay. The shift in their relationship was gradual, so subtle that Alex didn't recognize it at first. Marcus would linger when saying goodbye, his hand resting on Alex's shoulder a moment longer than necessary. Alex caught himself looking forward to Marcus's texts, found excuses to call him during the day. When they were in the same room, Alex was hyper-aware of Marcus's presence, of where he was standing, of whether he was looking in Alex's direction. The first time something truly inappropriate happened, Alex was nursing a split lip from one of David's outbursts the night before. David had left early for work without acknowledging what had happened, leaving Alex alone with his shame and a face that told a story he wasn't ready to share with the world. Marcus came by unexpectedly, bringing coffee and pastries from Alex's favorite bakery. When he saw Alex's face, his expression shifted from concern to something harder, angrier. He set down the coffee with deliberate care and asked Alex to tell him exactly what had happened. Alex found himself telling the truth, not the sanitized version he'd been giving friends and family, but the real truth. How David had come home drunk again, how he'd started a fight over nothing, how it had escalated until David's palm connected with Alex's face with a sound that seemed to echo in their bedroom long after David had passed out. Marcus listened without interruption, his jaw tight with controlled anger. When Alex finished talking, Marcus reached out and gently touched the uninjured side of Alex's face. The touch was tender, careful, full of a compassion that Alex hadn't felt in months. Without thinking, Alex leaned into the touch, closing his eyes against the relief of being cared for without conditions or apologies. They stayed like that for a long moment, Marcus's thumb brushing across Alex's cheekbone, Alex allowing himself to be comforted. When Alex opened his eyes, Marcus was looking at him with an expression that made Alex's breath catch. There was concern there, yes, but also something deeper, more complicated. Marcus pulled his hand away as if he'd been burned, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. He apologized, said he'd overstepped, but Alex found himself reaching out to stop him from leaving. They stood there in Alex's kitchen, the air between them charged with possibility and guilt in equal measure. Nothing happened that day beyond that touch, but something fundamental had shifted. They both knew it, and neither of them knew how to unknow it. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Alex began orbiting each other differently. Marcus still came by to check on Alex, still provided support during David's bad nights, but now there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't existed before. They were more careful with each other, more aware of accidental touches, of moments when they were alone together. Alex found himself thinking about Marcus during the long hours when David was at work. He'd replay conversations they'd had, analyze the way Marcus looked at him, wonder what would have happened if he hadn't pulled away that day in the kitchen. The guilt of these thoughts was overwhelming, but not overwhelming enough to stop them. Marcus, for his part, seemed to be fighting his own internal battle. He'd catch himself staring at Alex, then look away quickly. He'd start to say something, then change the subject. There were moments when Alex was sure Marcus was going to confess something, to acknowledge the tension between them, but he always pulled back at the last moment. The turning point came on a night when David didn't come home at all. He'd gone out with colleagues after work and simply disappeared. Alex waited up until 3 a.m, calling David's phone repeatedly, getting no answer. When Marcus called to check in, something he'd started doing when David was out late, Alex broke down completely. Marcus came over immediately, finding Alex sobbing on the living room floor, surrounded by the debris of a panic attack, scattered tissues, David's phone going straight to voicemail, Alex's own phone with a dozen unanswered calls to David's number. Marcus gathered Alex up without hesitation, holding him while he cried, stroking his hair and murmuring reassurances. When Alex finally calmed down enough to speak, the words came pouring out, not just about that night, but about everything. The fear, the loneliness, the way he felt like he was losing himself in the chaos of David's addiction. The way he sometimes lay awake at night wondering if this was what the rest of his life would look like. The way he'd started to dread coming home, to flinch when he heard David's key in the lock. Marcus listened to all of it, his arms tightening around Alex as the full scope of the situation became clear. When Alex finished talking, Marcus pulled back just enough to look at him, his eyes bright with unshed tears. That's when it happened, their first kiss. Alex couldn't say who initiated it, whether Marcus leaned down or Alex reached up, but suddenly their lips were touching and the world seemed to shift on its axis. It was soft, tentative, nothing like the passionate encounters Alex had imagined during his guilty moments of fantasy. It tasted like tears and coffee and the mint gum Marcus always chewed. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it changed everything. They broke apart, both breathing hard, staring at each other with a mixture of want and horror. Marcus started to apologize, but Alex stopped him, pressing their foreheads together and admitting in a whisper that he'd been thinking about this for weeks. Marcus confessed the same, his voice rough with emotion and guilt. David came home the next morning with no explanation for where he'd been, no apology for the worry he'd caused. He was hungover and irritable, dismissive of Alex's concern, and when Marcus stopped by later that day, David barely acknowledged his presence. The contrast between David's casual cruelty and Marcus's gentle attention felt stark and painful. What followed was weeks of internal torment for both Alex and Marcus. They tried to pretend the kiss hadn't happened, tried to go back to their previous dynamic, but it was impossible. The awareness of their mutual attraction hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and impossible to ignore. They began creating opportunities to be alone together. Marcus would stop by when he knew David was at work. Alex would find excuses to meet Marcus for coffee or lunch. These meetings were ostensibly innocent, but charged with unspoken desire and mounting emotional intimacy. They talked about everything during these stolen hours together. Marcus shared stories from his childhood with David, giving Alex insight into the man he'd married that he'd never had before. Alex talked about his dreams, his fears, his growing certainty that his marriage was destroying both him and David. Marcus spoke about his career, his family, his own past relationships and why they'd never worked out. Through these conversations, Alex began to understand that his feelings for Marcus weren't just born from gratitude or desperation. Marcus was funny in a quiet way, thoughtful about big questions, passionate about social justice in a way that David had never been. He remembered details about Alex's life that David had started forgetting, the name of Alex's difficult coworker, Alex's favorite author, the anniversary of Alex's father's death. More than that, Marcus saw Alex clearly in a way that Alex was beginning to realize David never had. David loved Alex, but he loved an idealized version, the supportive spouse who didn't make waves, who managed the household and emotions while David focused on his career. Marcus seemed to love Alex's complexity, his occasional moodiness, his strong opinions about movies and politics and the correct way to make coffee. The first time they slept together, it wasn't planned. Marcus had come over to help Alex deal with damage from one of David's rages, a broken picture frame, a dent in the wall where David had thrown his keys. David had disappeared again, this time for 2 days, leaving Alex to clean up the physical and emotional wreckage alone. Alex was on his knees in the living room, picking up pieces of glass from their wedding photo, when he suddenly started crying. Not the quiet tears he'd grown accustomed to, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from someplace he'd been protecting for months. Marcus knelt beside him, pulling him away from the broken glass and into his arms. Alex clung to him, soaking Marcus's shirt with tears, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of his grief for his marriage, his fear for David, his exhaustion from trying to hold everything together. When the crying finally stopped, Alex found himself looking up at Marcus, seeing his own pain reflected in Marcus's eyes. Marcus loved David too, had loved him for most of his life, and watching his best friend self-destruct while hurting Alex was tearing Marcus apart as well. This time when they kissed, it wasn't tentative. It was desperate, full of months of suppressed longing and shared pain. Marcus's hands tangled in Alex's hair, Alex's fingers clutched at Marcus's shoulders, and neither of them pulled away when the kiss deepened. They made love on the living room floor, surrounded by the wreckage of Alex's marriage, with a tenderness that Alex had almost forgotten was possible. Marcus touched him like he was precious, looked at him like he was something worth cherishing. For the first time in months, Alex felt truly seen, truly wanted, truly safe. Afterward, lying in Marcus's arms on the carpet, Alex felt the full weight of what they'd done settle over him. The guilt was crushing, but underneath it was something else, a sense of rightness that terrified him. Being with Marcus felt like coming home to himself, like remembering who he was underneath all the anxiety and fear that had become his default state. What followed was nearly a year of living two completely different lives. With David, Alex continued to play the role of the concerned spouse, managing David's moods and drinking, cleaning up after his outbursts, hoping against hope that something would change. With Marcus, Alex discovered parts of himself he'd forgotten existed, his sense of humor, his capacity for joy, his ability to feel desired and desirable. The logistics of the affair were complicated and stressful. Marcus would come over when David was at work, and they'd spend stolen hours talking and making love in the bed Alex shared with his husband. They'd meet at Marcus's apartment, where Alex would lose himself in the fantasy of a life without walking on eggshells, without fear, without the constant undercurrent of violence. They took weekend trips when David was on his increasingly frequent benders, driving to small towns where no one knew them, pretending to be a couple, allowing themselves to imagine what their life could be like together. During these escapes, Alex would catch glimpses of who he could be, relaxed, spontaneous, unafraid. Marcus would take pictures of him laughing, and Alex wouldn't recognize himself in them. But the guilt was constant and corrosive. Alex loved David, still loved him, despite everything, and the knowledge that he was betraying not just his husband but also David's best friend ate at him constantly. He'd lie awake at night, David's arm around him, thinking about Marcus's hands on his body earlier that day. The compartmentalization required to maintain both relationships was exhausting. Marcus struggled with his own guilt as well. He'd loved David like a brother for over 20 years, had been the best man at David and Alex's wedding, had sworn to support their marriage. Now he was actively undermining it, pulling Alex away from David emotionally and physically, offering him an alternative that made staying in his marriage seem impossible. They talked about the situation constantly, whether they should tell David, whether Alex should leave, whether they had a future together beyond these stolen moments. Marcus wanted Alex to leave David, to choose their relationship openly. Alex was torn between his love for Marcus, his guilt over David, and his complex feelings about his marriage vows. The situation was further complicated by David's escalating behavior. His drinking had progressed to the point where he was missing work, where friends were starting to express concern, where Alex was genuinely afraid for David's safety. During his worst episodes, David would become paranoid, accusing Alex of various betrayals, though never the actual one Alex was committing. Ironically, Alex found that his relationship with Marcus made him more patient with David, not less. The emotional support and love he was receiving from Marcus gave him the strength to continue caring for David without completely losing himself. Marcus would hold Alex while he cried about David's latest episode, would help him strategize ways to encourage David to get help, would provide the emotional reservoir that allowed Alex to keep trying to save his marriage even while he was betraying it. As the months passed, Alex and Marcus's relationship evolved beyond the physical. They developed their own traditions. Marcus would bring Alex coffee from a specific cafe every Tuesday. Alex would cook dinner for Marcus every Friday when David worked late. They had inside jokes, shared opinions about books and movies, a sexual compatibility that surprised them both with its intensity. Marcus was everything David wasn't: emotionally available, consistently kind, interested in Alex's thoughts and feelings. Where David had become unpredictable and sometimes cruel, Marcus was steady and gentle. Where David had started taking Alex for granted, Marcus treated every moment they had together as precious. Alex found himself falling in love in a way that felt completely different from his relationship with David. His love for David had been built over time, growing from friendship and shared experiences into something comfortable and familiar. His love for Marcus was more intense, more conscious, born from seeing each other clearly in circumstances that demanded complete honesty. They began to plan for a future together, though the conversations were always tinged with guilt and uncertainty. Marcus wanted to find a job in another city, wanted Alex to come with him, wanted them to start over somewhere no one knew their history. Alex was tempted by the vision Marcus painted, a life where he could be himself completely, where he could love and be loved without fear, where he could wake up every morning next to someone who made him feel safe and valued. But the weight of his commitment to David, the complexity of his feelings about his marriage, and the devastating betrayal he was perpetrating made it impossible for Alex to make any definitive decisions about the future. He was trapped between his love for two different men, his guilt over his deception, and his growing understanding that the current situation was unsustainable for everyone involved. Nearly a year into the affair, the strain of maintaining the double life was becoming unbearable for both Alex and Marcus. Alex had lost weight, was having trouble sleeping, was experiencing anxiety attacks when he had to transition between his two relationships. Marcus was struggling with his own guilt and frustration, torn between his love for Alex and his lifelong loyalty to David. The situation came to a head when David, in one of his drunken rages, hit Alex hard enough to leave a bruise that couldn't be hidden. Alex showed up at Marcus's apartment that night, his eyes swollen shut, his lips split, his faith in his ability to help David finally shattered. Marcus took one look at Alex's face and something fundamental shifted in him. His guilt over betraying David was eclipsed by his fury at seeing Alex hurt, his protective instincts overriding his loyalty to his childhood friend. He wanted to confront David immediately, to end the charade and force the truth into the open. Alex begged him not to, terrified of what David might do if he discovered the affair, worried that the shock might push David over some edge from which he couldn't return. But Marcus's patience was exhausted. He'd watched his best friend hurt the person he loved, had enabled the situation by keeping their secret, had allowed Alex to continue putting himself in danger. They fought about it, their first real fight, with Marcus arguing that Alex's safety was more important than protecting David from the consequences of his actions, and Alex insisting that he needed more time to figure out how to handle the situation. The fight ended with both of them in tears, holding each other on Marcus's couch, both acknowledging that they couldn't continue living in limbo indefinitely. In the days following that confrontation, Alex found himself unable to maintain the pretense of normalcy with David. The physical evidence of David's violence was impossible to hide, and David's complete lack of acknowledgement of what he'd done, his refusal to even discuss the incident, made Alex realize that his husband was beyond the reach of love or loyalty or hope. Alex began to understand that staying in his marriage wasn't helping David, it was enabling him, providing him with a target for his rage and someone to clean up after his destructive episodes. By absorbing David's violence and maintaining their household despite David's drinking, Alex was making it possible for David to avoid facing the full consequences of his addiction. The realization was devastating but also liberating. If staying wasn't helping David, then Alex's guilt over wanting to leave was misplaced. His marriage vows had promised to love and honor David, but they hadn't promised to accept abuse or to sacrifice his own well-being indefinitely. At the same time, Alex's relationship with Marcus had evolved into something that felt permanent and right, despite its origins in betrayal. Marcus had proven himself to be not just a lover but a true partner, someone who supported Alex's best self, who treated him with consistent kindness, who offered him a vision of love that didn't require him to diminish himself. The decision to come clean began to feel not just necessary but inevitable. Alex realized that he couldn't move forward with Marcus while living a lie, couldn't continue to betray David even if David was betraying their marriage through his violence and addiction, couldn't keep asking Marcus to participate in a deception that was destroying all three of them. Alex decided to tell David everything. Not just about the affair, but about how David's drinking and violence had affected him, about his own needs and feelings that had been subordinated to managing David's addiction, about his decision to leave their marriage regardless of whether David got help. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning when David was sober and calm, eating breakfast at their kitchen table like they were a normal couple having a normal morning. Alex sat down across from him and simply began talking. He told David about the affair first, watching his husband's face change from confusion to shock to devastation. He told him about falling in love with Marcus, about the months of deception, about the guilt that was eating him alive. David listened in stunned silence, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Then Alex told David about the impact of his drinking and violence, how afraid Alex had become, how isolated, how diminished. He told David about the bruises, about the nights spent lying awake in fear, about the way Alex had started to lose himself in the chaos of David's addiction. Finally, Alex told David that he was leaving. Not just because of the affair, though that had clarified things for him, but because their marriage had become something that was destroying them both. He told David that he loved him, would always love him, but that love wasn't enough to sustain a relationship built on fear and deception and mutual destruction. David's reaction was everything Alex had expected and feared. There was rage, devastation, accusations, and threats. David demanded to know how long the affair had been going on, whether Marcus had pursued Alex or vice versa, whether they'd been laughing at him behind his back. He called Alex names that cut deep, accused him of destroying their marriage, of betraying not just him but Marcus as well. But underneath David's anger, Alex could see something else, relief, maybe, or recognition. As if part of David had known that their marriage was unsustainable, that something had to give, that the current situation was slowly killing all of them. The revelation destroyed David and Marcus's friendship immediately and completely. David felt betrayed not just as a husband but as a friend, unable to separate his anger at Alex from his fury at Marcus. Marcus, for his part, felt the full weight of his betrayal of their lifelong friendship, the realization that he'd chosen love over loyalty in a way that couldn't be undone. David's family and friends were shocked by the news of the affair and the end of the marriage. Some sided with David, viewing Alex as the villain who had destroyed a marriage and a friendship. Others, who had witnessed David's drinking and occasional glimpses of his treatment of Alex, understood the situation as more complex. Alex moved in with Marcus temporarily, though they both understood that they needed time to process the end of Alex's marriage and the destruction of Marcus and David's friendship before they could truly begin their relationship openly. The transition was harder than either of them had expected. The guilt and grief were overwhelming, even as they were finally free to be together. David, faced with the complete collapse of his most important relationships, was forced to confront his drinking in a way he'd never had to before. Without Alex to manage the fallout from his behavior, without Marcus to provide unconditional support, David found himself truly alone with his addiction for the first time. Alex learned that David had entered rehab 3 months after their separation, though they had no direct contact. The news came through mutual friends, and Alex felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. He wondered if their marriage might have survived if David had been willing to address his drinking earlier, but he also knew that the person he'd become in that marriage, fearful, diminished, constantly walking on eggshells, wasn't someone he could return to being. A year later, Alex and Marcus were still together, their relationship having survived the transition from secret affair to open partnership. They'd moved to a different city, partly to escape the complicated social dynamics of their shared history, partly to start fresh somewhere no one knew their story. The guilt hadn't disappeared entirely. Alex still sometimes woke up thinking about David, wondering how he was doing, feeling the weight of the promises he'd broken and the friendship between David and Marcus that had been destroyed. Marcus struggled with his own guilt, grieving the loss of his oldest friendship while trying to build a life with Alex. But they'd also discovered that their love could survive in the daylight, that the connection they'd found in secrecy was real and lasting. Marcus continued to be the kind of partner Alex had never known he could have, emotionally present, consistently kind, interested in Alex's growth and happiness as much as his own. Alex had returned to therapy, working through the trauma of his marriage, the complexity of his guilt over the affair, and his own patterns in relationships. He'd learned to recognize the signs of his own diminishment, to value his own needs and feelings, to understand that love without respect and safety wasn't sustainable. They'd heard through mutual friends that David had completed rehab and was doing well, that he'd started dating someone new, that he'd gotten a promotion at work. Alex felt genuinely happy for David's recovery, even as he knew their own relationship could never be repaired. The betrayal had been too complete, the hurt too deep, for friendship to be possible. Looking back, Alex understood that his affair with Marcus had been both the worst thing he'd ever done and the thing that had saved his life. The betrayal of David had been real and inexcusable, but it had also been the catalyst that forced all 3 of them to confront truths they'd been avoiding. Alex had learned that love alone wasn't enough to sustain a relationship, that respect, safety, and compatibility were equally important. He'd learned that staying in a destructive situation out of loyalty or guilt helped no one, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave. He'd also learned about the complexity of human emotion, about how it was possible to love two people simultaneously, about how guilt and happiness could coexist in the same heart. The affair had taught him about his own capacity for deception, but also about his capacity for growth, for making difficult choices, for rebuilding his life from scratch. Marcus had his own lessons to process, about the cost of keeping secrets, about the difference between loyalty and enabling, about how love sometimes requires you to betray other loyalties. He'd lost his oldest friend but gained a deeper understanding of himself and what he needed in a relationship. Most importantly, Alex had learned that he deserved to be loved without conditions, without fear, without having to diminish himself to maintain peace. His relationship with Marcus wasn't perfect. They still struggled with guilt, with the complicated origins of their love, with the knowledge that their happiness had come at such a high cost to others. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it had taught Alex that it was possible to love and be loved fully, honestly, safely. The price had been enormous: a marriage, a friendship, their shared history, their reputation in their community. But Alex couldn't bring himself to regret the choice entirely, because it had led him to a life where he could be himself completely, where he could wake up every morning without fear, where he could love someone who loved him back with equal intensity and commitment. The story didn't have a clean ending, because real life rarely does. David, Alex, and Marcus were all still processing the aftermath of that year of secrets and betrayal. They were all building new lives, learning new patterns, trying to understand how to love better and more honestly in the future. But Alex had learned something crucial about himself and about love, that sometimes the most destructive thing you can do is stay, that sometimes betrayal is a symptom of a deeper truth that needs to be acknowledged, that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to hurt people you love. It wasn't a lesson he'd wanted to learn, and it wasn't a story he was proud to tell. But it was his story, with all its complexity and pain and imperfect resolution. And in living it, he'd discovered who he was capable of being when he stopped trying to be who he thought he should be, and started being who he actually was.